What's up, guys? Welcome to a second round playoff matchup between the Boston Bruins and the Florida Panthers. So, yes, we are seeing a rematch between these two teams. They faced off against each other in the 2023 Stanley Cup Playoffs last year, where Florida won in 7 games, pulling an upset versus the President Trophy winners, the Boston Bruins, who held the record for best regular season record in history. So, the Boston Bruins were the mighty Kings who fell last year, and they were leading 3-1. They blew it. And then this year versus the Toronto Maple Leafs, they had a 3-1 lead, and, Toronto caught up, tied it 3-3. We thought it was game over. History was going to repeat itself. But Boston did not let that happen, and they beat the Toronto Maple Leafs once again. So history doesn't lie because it seems like Boston just loves beating Toronto in game 7. So they win the series 4-3. They win in overtime by a goal from David Pastrnak to win 2-1. Joseph Woll was not in nets. He, had an injury, so they brought back Samsonov. Would the score have been different if Woll was in nets instead of Samsonov? Could be because he was lights out in Toronto's game 5 and 6 wins. And but Nylander wasn't there at the beginning of the season as well. At the beginning of the matchup as well. So maybe that contributed to them losing. And once Nylander came back, scored a goal in game 7, scored 2 goals in game 6. He was very clutch, and helped them, compete in this series. But unfortunately, the core four, once again, they don't get it done. High expectations once again this season. And, they fall short of high expectations once again. And Toronto, loses in the first round after last year beating the Tampa Bay Lightning in the first round, which we thought, oh my God, things are looking up for Toronto. But it seems like things in the world are back at what it was, and Toronto is once again a choke artist in the first round. And now the Boston Bruins are going to be facing Florida, who beat the Tampa Bay Lightning 4-1. So Tampa gets eliminated in the first round in 2 consecutive years. This time it only lasts 5 games. Tampa played most of the series without Sergachev. He came back. They won. But unfortunately, game 5, Florida just took advantage and blew past Tampa Bay, winning 6-1. So in that series, Florida won 3-2. Game 1, game 2, they won in overtime 3-2. Game 3, they won 5-3. Game 4, they lost 6-3. Game 5, they lost 6-1. And obviously the Florida Panthers are probably the favorites this time, but Boston has vengeance here. They want revenge versus the Florida Panthers, who, win Game 7 and go on this magical run to the finals last year and lose versus the Vegas Golden Knights. So, in many people's eyes, if the Boston Bruins would have beat the Florida Panthers, we could have potentially seen a Boston Bruins versus Vegas Golden Knights final, which they took that away from them. So they have a lot to play for, and I expect this to be a very physical matchup. It's going to be defensively tight. Both goalies are going to be playing, the best games of their lives. We saw what Jeremy Swayman was capable of doing. We saw what Bobrovsky was capable of doing. Bobrovsky is one of the nominees for the Vezina this year, and deservedly so. So it's going to be a fantastic goaltending duo. But, what are your thoughts, Luca, on this matchup?
Yeah, well, I want to just say first and foremost, obviously to everyone in the comments who is going to rip me for taking Toronto in 7 games, I just want to say I'm sorry. I was wrong, but look, at the end of the day, they did make it close. It was a close series up until the end, and it was an overtime winner that made the difference. But ultimately, I think the Bruins do deserve to be in this position. Like you mentioned, you look at a matchup that they had. You look at Jeremy Swayman and how well he played during these playoffs. They got the goaltending when they needed to get it, and he was spectacular. So, fair play to the Bruins. They end up going through this series. But talking about this series and talking about the Florida Panthers versus the Boston Bruins, there is, some interesting history, obviously, between these two teams going back to last year where, the Bruins blew a 3-1 lead, like you mentioned, and then they ended up losing in 7 games to the Florida Panthers. This year, though, I think it's going to be very interesting because I don't know where the Bruins are at. Like, it looks, what it felt like against Toronto? They started off really well. right? Like the first 4 games of the playoffs, the series, you're like, okay, you know what? They're clearly the better team than Toronto. Toronto's banged up. They don't have a bunch of players that are in the lineup. Matthews is not at 100%. Nylander wasn't playing for like the first 3 games of the series. So there was some factors there that made a difference. Obviously, Joseph Wool wasn't in net, but it felt like in Game 5 and Game 6, you kind of felt like maybe the Bruins aren't as good as we thought, and maybe the Leafs just elevated their game. But what I'm trying to say to this is, I look at this matchup against Florida, and I don't think Boston's going to be able to get past Florida. And the reason I say that is, you watch the Tampa series, like Florida was all over them. Like they outplayed Tampa like every single game, pretty much, right? And apart from the one game that they lost, in which Vasilevsky played really well, and they ended up winning that game in the sense where it was a game that just Florida couldn't end up getting the win. But at the end of the day, like if you look at everything, it was one of those games where Florida was in it up until the end, and then 2 empty net goals is what cost them the loss. But after that, like every other game, you know, they were solid both offensively and defensively. They were able to close the series down. They're a physical team that is, in your face, and they get goal scoring from everybody. And I feel like that's going to be a big difference for Florida. Is yes, Boston's got the goaltending with Jeremy Swayman, and he's been fantastic in these playoffs. Yes, the Bruins do have, some physical players as well, and are, the big bad Bruins to some extent. But one of the biggest things that I gotta say about Florida is they're just complete all around, right? They remind me a little bit of the Dallas Stars and the Vegas Golden Knights. Great goaltending, good defense, great offense, and pretty much everybody on this team could score, right? You look at the top goal scorers for Florida. Verhaeghe's got 9 points in 5 games. Kachuk had 9 points in 5 games. Barkov at 5 in 5 games. And then Gustav Forsling, 4 assists. Anton Lundell, 4 assists. Sam Reinhart scored 3 goals for 3 points. Tarasenko had a goal, 2 assists. So everybody contributed for the Florida Panthers in the Tampa Bay series. And it was one of those things where it's like it's a collective effort. Like you'll get production from everybody. Now I know they don't have Sam Bennett because he's hurt, but even with Sam Bennett being out, they were still able to find a way to beat Tampa. And it's impressive. Like Florida last year, they were kind of the underdog in the sense where nobody really thought that they were going to do anything. They were down 3-1 against the Bruins. They ended up coming back. They won. Then they go to beat Toronto in 5 games, and then they go sweep Carolina in 4. And then they beat they lose to Vegas in the Stanley Cup final, and it was a great run. But this year, I don't think Florida's the underdog in this series. I think they're the favorite, and I
Yeah,
think they're probably going to beat them. Right?
it's
Like
the opposite this year.
yeah, like Boston's the underdog because first of all, I think just on paper from a team perspective, I do think that the Bruins are not necessarily built the same way as Florida. And the other thing too is like even just yes, Boston got a lot of production from a lot of guys, but apart from Swayman and Marsha, nobody else really had a standout playoff. Like Pasternak scored the big goal, obviously in overtime, 5 points in 7 games. He's been okay. But Charlie McAvoy 4 assists, he's been okay. But Brad Marchand's got 8 points in 7 games. He was good. And Jake DeBrusk had a couple of moments at the beginning of the series where he looked good. So it's one of those things where it's like from a depth perspective, Boston just can't compete with Florida in that regard. Like they don't have the offensive depth, they don't have the defensive depth. The only thing they have is the goaltending, which showing, seeing from other teams and just seeing from this series, yeah, a goaltending can definitely win you a series. I mean, we've seen it with Carey Price in Montreal in the past. We've seen it with Henrik Lundqvist with the Rangers. We've seen it with a bunch of goaltenders. So it's definitely not impossible that the Bruins are gonna, get revenge on the Florida Panthers. I just don't see it. I just don't think there's enough there for the Bruins. I think the last 3 games that Boston played against Toronto, I think showed that there's some flaws in their game. And I just think Florida is going to steamroll these guys. Like, I think they're going to come in
Wait,
and
wait,
just
wait.
absolutely like
Let's not
kill them.
put that into notion right now because, you know, these are the two best teams in the Atlantic. First place and second place team. Teams that
Right.
have got over 100 points. You look at Boston's roster compared to last year, and you're like, how did this team manage to get past 100 points? And how did they even make the playoffs without a first line, second line center, right? And they did that. Look, you look at the face-off percentage in the first series versus Toronto. They were horrible.
Yeah.
Every single time. they were in the offensive zone, they would lose key face-offs.
Yeah.
John Tavares was winning them. Okay,
Yeah.
every single time. For me, Charlie Coyle and Zaka were the most disappointing in that series. Not just because of their poor face-off percentage, but also in terms of the production. These two guys are your first and second line center. They need to be better. They need to
Right.
win face-offs in the offensive zone. When you're taking your goalie out, you're putting on your best players. You need to win that key face-off. Pass it back to the winger. Pass it to the defenseman. Take a shot. Create a play. Right. But when you're not winning a face-off, you're just giving the puck away to Toronto. For example, Toronto in the first round, where they have advantage, they have possession of the puck, and they can easily shoot in the empty net, and it's done. So they need to be better in this
Right.
series. For me, the best center they had was Trent Frederick. 5+5 for his plus minus, had 3 points, which were all goals in 7 games. Geeky did a good job as well. So
Yeah.
when your third line and fourth line, centers are doing better than your first line and second line center, it's it's not good. Like, you need production from everybody, and you need those two guys to step up in particular. So if they if they want to win this series, those two guys are gonna have to wake up. There was a lot of pressure on Pasternak. Oh, he needs to step up. Jim Montgomery said that, which he did step up and score the OT winner. But why wasn't the focus on Coyle and Zaka? I felt there was too much pressure on Pasternak to get it done, when Coyle and Zaka, deserved a little bit more criticism. And look, DeBrusque, I thought he had a great start to the series. He fizzled out towards the end, but Lindholm really stepped it up last game. If Lindholm could play like he did last game and play the way that he did all of last season, okay, they are going to be a very dangerous team, and I could see this going to 7 games. But if Lindholm does not continue this consistency from game 7 into this round, if Coyle and Zaka are still losing faceoffs that they need to win and their production is not good enough, they are losing in 5 games.
I think
Easily.
I think the other thing. Look, I'm gonna give Boston credit. They're very well coached.
They
I think
are. They are.
Montgomery's a great coach. I think he's shown that. I mean, he outcoached Keefe, which I mean, it's not hard to do, but still, like it's still one of those things where like he did outcoach Sheldon Keefe. And he played his cards right at the end of the day. They won the series, but. I look at it more from this perspective where it's like, Florida's got a great coach in Paul Maurice, and we all know how good of a coach he is with those group of players. And for me, like it's a tough matchup for Boston in the sense that I I know that they were one of the best teams in the Atlantic going into the playoffs, and you know they ended up becoming the second seed in the Atlantic and ended up playing Toronto. But you look at this team, right, and it's like, to your point, right? Zaka wasn't great. Charlie Coyle wasn't great. And like when you look at your top two centers right now that's listed as Charlie Coyle and Morgan Geekie, right? And you're coming up against Barkov, you're coming up against Lundell, you're coming up against, guys that have played center before, on the Florida Panthers in terms of like, Sam Reinhart, who's played a little bit at center. You have even a guy like Sam Bennett, who I know is out right now, but, he's also a key factor for them. It becomes a really difficult matchup because you're putting yourself against one of the best defensive players in the league in Alexander Barkov, one of the most underrated defensive players in the league, right? Anton Lundell, who's very good and has really taken up a very good elevated role during his time. And then you have a guy like Sam Reinhart who, scored 50 goals this year, like more than 50 goals this year. So like you're putting yourself in a position where, you're coming up against a juggernaut in Florida that is, very good offensively. And even on the winger side, like if you just look at the offensive matchup, right? Like Carter Verhaeghe, Matthew Tkachuk, guys like Sam Reinhart who can play on the wing as well, Vlad Tarasenko, right? Like these are all big players that, play big roles for Florida and are guys that are, very good in the playoffs, are playoff performers, right? We saw what Carter Verhaeghe was able to do. So it puts into perspective that, yes, Boston is not a bad team, but if they play the way they played in game 5 and game 6 against Toronto, they're going to get annihilated because it's not the same sort of opponent. And with Florida, you cannot make mistakes against this team because that's the one thing that I've noticed about Florida is they're very good at making you pay. and they're very good at putting shots on net and finding pucks through traffic and being able to kind of, put pressure on the other team to make mistakes. So Boston's going to have to be very smart with how they want to play Florida and how they want to go and pursue this. The other thing, too, is, they're not coming up against an Ilya Samsonov. And I know that, Bobrovsky has an 896 save percentage. His numbers aren't fantastic against Tampa. Mind you, Tampa's a very good offensive team, too. So it's not too surprising. But you're not coming up against a Ilya Samsonov. You're coming up against a goalie who's in the Vezina conversation, right? So now you're going to have to find ways to beat him. You're going to have to find ways to, score on him. You're going to have to find ways to make sure that when you have a lead in the hockey game, that you're going to be able to keep it. And that's going to be a really tough task, I think, for the Bruins, especially if they play the way they played in Game 5 and Game 6. And even to some extent yesterday, which, yes, they didn't play bad, but they weren't necessarily at their best either, and they found a way to win.
They
So
only they only picked it up, I would say. Like, we saw a version of the game 1 to 2 and 3 Bruins
right,
as soon as Lindholm scored. That's when they
exactly.
regained form, and that's why they won the game.
Yeah,
But game 5, game 6, and a good portion of game 7, we were seeing a very vulnerable Boston
yeah,
Bruins where, okay,
agreed.
there's things that are not working for them anymore, and they're not invincible. This is a team that's beatable, like you were mentioning
Right.
before.
So that's what it is. It's like it's one of those things where it's like, and I'm not saying Florida's like not beatable either. Florida's got their own flaws as well in terms of the way they play sometimes on defense, and Bobrovsky, he's hit or miss in the sense where like you don't know what you're gonna get with him, but 90% of the time you're gonna get a very good Bobrovsky, and he might have one or two bad games. But if Bobrovsky plays the way he played during the regular season, and even if he plays a little bit better than he did in the Tampa series, like I don't know how Boston wins the series. I really don't. But again, right? I did say it before, and I'm going to say it again. If Jeremy Swayman, on the other hand, plays the way he played in the first round of the series, Boston has a chance, right?
Yeah.
And that's what it comes down to at the end of the day, too. Which is, Boston, like I said, is not the most built team to play against Florida. They don't have the same type of caliber players, but one thing they do have is a hot goaltender and a guy who single-handedly, I would say to some extent, pretty much won them the series against against the Leafs. So you put that into perspective, and you go, if Swayman can be the way he did it, the way he was against Toronto, yeah, they've got a shot, right? Because they have a goalie who's on fire. But if Swayman even falls off his game even a little bit, it's done. And I know they've got Olmark as well, but it's still even at that, like I don't know like if Boston's gonna have enough to beat Florida. So for me personally, if I had to make a prediction right now, I don't want to say Florida in 7 because I don't think that's realistic. I'm gonna say Florida in 6. I think Boston takes 2 games, but I think ultimately Florida just has too
Look,
much and they beat them in 6.
this whole rotation thing between Allmark and Swayman needs to end. I don't think Allmark is going to be
Well,
back
it did
anyways
end.
next season. Yeah, I know, but like this is a whole new series, right? They tried it out with Allmark. It wasn't his fault why they lost. Okay, that game that he played, he did a very good job. But Swayman, this whole series, has clearly been the better goalie, and that's what they ran with him. And they need to continue running with him, even if they lose game 1. They need to
Yeah,
continue going with him. He's the better suited goalie, and he's going to be the starting goaltender of the future. They tried to trading Allmark during the deadline, so and he knows that. So like, this is probably the last time he's going to be playing with the Boston Bruins. I see him gone during the offseason. There's a lot of teams that are high in the goalie market that are looking for a starting goaltender. They
yeah,
can't continue this forever, So Swayman is taking control of his crease, and he needs to continue doing that. Also, there's news that was announced right now that Paul Maurice says that Sam Bennett will not play game 1, but is considered day to day. So expect to
right.
see him sometime during the series. But, you know, the fact that you have Zaka move to the wing when he played majority of the season at center, and Geeky is your first line center now because he's been doing much better. Coyle stays at a second line. You have Trent Frederick who stays on the third line, and you have Bachfist on the fourth line. That's kind of concerning for me in terms of their center depth. And
Yeah,
the thing with the Florida Panthers is that even if Kachuk and Reinhardt are not getting it done over Hagee, they have other weapons. You have Tarasenko, you have Barkov, you have Rodriguez. And in terms of your back end, you have Ekblad, you have Montour, you have Larson, you have Forsling. And, Forsling had the best plus minus out of everybody in the whole league during the
yeah,
season, and now he's one of the best in the playoffs. This is a very consistent defenseman. He's known for his defensive game. But the fact that this guy was able to to get 4 points in 5 games, like he's playing fantastic. I would
Right.
say he was arguably their best defenseman in the first round. If he's your best defenseman, wow, this team is freaking deep.
But that's what I'm saying. Like he's and that's a compliment to Gustav Forsling because he's a
Yeah,
very underrated defenseman. Like he's very very good. And like you said, if he's your best defenseman and you still have guys like Ekblad and Montour on your team that are not at their best, like if those guys get going, like you're in trouble.
yeah. I said it in our
And
last
not that
video.
they didn't go, not that they weren't going in the Tampa series, but if they even up their game a little bit more, like it's over.
I said it in our last video of the Vancouver Canucks versus the Edmonton Oilers. Towards the end of the video, I said that you know, based off what I've seen in the Toronto Boston series and what I've seen Florida was capable of doing to Tampa in the first round, whoever would win that series between Toronto and Boston is going to lose to Florida, and
Yeah,
I still stand by it.
yeah,
But Boston is capable of pulling an upset because they faced this team in the past before. They had a very good record versus them in the regular season. They won all of their games, if I'm not mistaken, versus Florida this year. I think they were 4-0. So Boston's capable of, doing some damage. We got to put respect on their name. They won the President's Trophy last year. The same way that we didn't respect Florida last year and we were like, this team is crap. Well, they won the President's Trophy the year before that, so anything is possible. Boston did finish second in the Atlantic over teams like Tampa and Toronto, you know, and yeah, they're a well coached team. You look at their team on paper, they're not, anything, to scream about. They don't have Krejci anymore. They don't have Bergeron. And that was something that they were missing in the first round in terms of
yeah.
face-off percentage win. With Krejci and Bergeron on the circle, they would win majority of their face-offs, and that's what they were missing. If they would have them in the series, I would say it would be a lot more closer.
You know what?
Um,
You know what
yeah,
they need? They need an Elias Lindholm type of player. Boston. That's what they
yeah.
would have needed, and it's kind of funny because he's in Vancouver, but they were interested in him. But
We'll get him as
I
a UFA during the
yeah.
offseason, though. I'm
Yeah,
convinced.
but I do like I think one of the biggest things that Boston didn't do that they should have done, and I do think it's going to backfire for them in the second round, is address their center core. I think if they would have added a not a high profile center, but like a guy like Elias Lindholm uh, to their mix, I think they would have been in a much better spot just offensively. I think the fact that they lack that center depth, like you said, I think it's going to play a huge factor for them because I know that Toronto had better center depth and they still beat them, but even still, I still think like I think Florida's still better, and even their center depth, like Florida's not Toronto in terms of the way they play either, so that does play a role when it comes to that. So
Yeah, and you look at Verhage and Kachuk. They're playoff performers. They did it last year too. And I know people are like, "Oh, well, Kachuk had a down year, didn't get 100 points like the 2 other years." Who cares? He was still over 80 points this year, and it allowed guys like Reinhardt to elevate his game. And they added Tarasenko as well. They have other options as well, but the main core guys, Verhage, Kachuk, and Barkov, are getting it done. And secondary scoring like Tarasenko and Bennett, they're doing their part as well. Tarasenko, um, honestly, I think he's been a really good fit. I think he's been a better fit with Florida than he has been with the New York Rangers, who he got traded to last year.
yeah,
Um, you know, also another thing I like to mention is that Reinhardt, yeah, he only has 3 goals in 5 games. He doesn't have. Maybe he could have scored a lot more, but who cares?
right.
This is not the case where like Austin Matthews scored 69 goals and he did absolutely nothing in the first round of the playoffs the games that he did play, not the games obviously he missed. I'm not gonna
Hey, what are
count
you talking
that.
about? He got an assist yesterday.
Oh wow, ooh. He could score 69 goals in the regular season, but he couldn't even score a goal when it mattered most. Anyways, my whole point is that you know, honestly, Toronto's main guys didn't show up, and that's where they lost. And they didn't put Wool at the start of at the start of the series, which is another factor where they lost. But at least they tied it up 3-3. But still, they had to win that series. They had to get over the hump, like you said in the first round video. This is a team that's due, and they unfortunately were not due. Boston won, but look, Florida versus Boston overall. I do believe that Florida will win the series in 5 to 6 games. If Boston does not address, their center position in terms of, getting better at winning faceoffs, in terms of Coyle and Zaka producing a lot more offensively, they cannot put too much pressure on Pasternak and Marchand to get it done.
Yeah.
Because yeah, they don't have the flashiest names on this roster, but come on, this is a team that finished second in the Atlantic. They're well coached. They could get production from a guy like Van Riensdijk and DeBrusque, and
Yeah.
even guys like the guys who surprised me in this series, Brazo and Lorai on defense here.
Yeah.
Mason Lorai, I thought, had a really good series versus Toronto, and I liked how he was pinching a lot. He would come up offensively, and he has good hands too. You know, when Lindholm was not being productive the first couple of games, Lorai, yes, he only had 1 point, but offensively, we saw what he was capable of doing, and eventually, if it continues to do that, there will be results. But
You
we'll
know
see.
who you know who impressed me in the Boston series on defense? I'm actually going to be honest. Parker Wotherspoon.
Yeah,
Like
they used to
he
utilize them a lot too.
he like I don't know. I know he's a top six defenseman. He doesn't like play all that much, but like in the games in the minutes that he did play, and I was watching some of the game like even last night and early on in the series when he was playing, like dude, this guy's like a steady defenseman, man. Like he's really like not that bad, and he played a really good like playoff series in the games that he played, and I was impressed, man. I was impressed with the player that he was. I was impressed with how he played, and I think ultimately at the end of the day, like he showed clearly that he can be a top six defenseman in the league. So that was good for Boston. But it's like you mentioned, right? If they can get production from guys like Coyle, guys like Zaka to some extent in terms of their center depth, and even if they can get more depth scoring as well, not in terms of like I'm not saying obviously Trent Frederick scored 3 goals, like that's depth scoring, but in general from guys like you know even their decor, like if Hampus Lindholm could get a goal, they need McAvoy to score some goals as well. If they can get a goal from like even guys like Zaka and Coyle, who are considered part of their core, like that'll help them a lot in this series. It's like you said, they can't really just rely on Pasternak and Marchand. Yes, Pasternak needs to be better, and he was yesterday, but in general, like if Pasternak can get going, I think the Bruins are going to be in a good position as well. But realistically, you're asking a lot from a Bruins team that I believe just played through, you know, a really tough series against the Leafs. And the other thing too is you have to also take into consideration Florida's rested, right? This is a team that cleared Tampa in 5, hasn't played in like what, a week or like 7 or 6 days or 5 days. So they're rested, right? They're ready to go. They're going to be motivated for game one. Boston's coming off a series against Toronto where they've just played a hard fought 7 game series, and now they have to jump into a second round series against Florida. They might be a little bit tired. They might be a little bit banged up. So that could play in Florida's favor, right? It could also be the other way around where Florida might be rusty and say, well, we haven't played in 5 days. Now we're playing Boston, who are warm because they just came off a 7 game series. It could work both ways. But I just think that a rested Florida could be tough for Boston as well, especially going, just coming off a 7 game series.
Yeah, I would also like to mention that, and this is something that a lot of people didn't talk about, the fact that Matt Grzelcyk,
Yeah,
Lauko, and Danton Heinen, three guys who played majority of the season, did not play every single game in the series and they won. It's pretty impressive that you have like young guys like Brazo and
right.
Beecher step up and Lorai step up and take over those guys' spots.
Yeah,
And it shows that the Boston Bruins, sure, they don't have the flashiest names, but they have a pretty good depth pool in terms of what they have uh, on defense and forwards. So
right.
that's another thing to take into consideration as well. So they do have, quite a few options, and because of Witherspoon and Lorai and Brazo stepping up, it gives them options, and that's always good because when we did our video, we weren't really high on those three guys. We were saying that these guys, they're young guys, there's really nothing to expect, and they really caught us by surprise. So, that's great. Also, I like to mention that Jeremy Swayman, finished second in the first round for best uh, goals
Goalie.
against average with
Yeah.
1.49. So that was fantastic. In terms of save percentage, he finished second uh, with 0.950. And in terms of shutouts, well, he didn't get any. But look, Joseph Woll, it's as clear as day. If this guy would have played the full series, would have been a whole different story because he
Oh,
played.
dude, if he plays game one, the Leafs win the series
Yeah,
easily,
look at that. Finished
easily,
first in both categories.
easily.
So that's pretty disappointing in my opinion. And yeah, uh, I would say that Keefe got outcoached because of mistakes like that, in my
Yeah,
opinion. But
I agree.
you know what the worst part is that Wool played a good chunk last year in their playoff run. Um, and he was successful, more successful than Samsonov. So I don't understand where the logic was to start Samsonov. And we know that Samsonov has a very bad track record in terms of playoff history. So, whatever, Keith. And what his comments that he made, he's out the door, in my opinion. It's time for a coaching change. Anyways, one last thing I'd like to mention in terms of um, playoff um, team stats. Well, the Boston Bruins had 49 points in 7 games collectively as a team. Um, and the Florida Panthers had a total of 57, so pretty close. Um, Florida did play 5 games. Their power play, Florida, 23.1. Boston Bruins were more successful at 35.3. Um, in terms of their penalty kill, Florida was on 80%, and the Boston Bruins were at 95.2. So in terms of special teams, Boston are the better team. But again, they did face two different opponents, but we'll see if that changes in the next series.
Yeah,
But Boston needs to continue being really good at special teams if they want to have a chance of winning the series. But like I
I
said,
agree.
it's going to come to um, 7 games if Boston plays well. If not, it's going to be 5 to 6 games for Florida. But like I said, guys, this is just our opinion at the end of the day. We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. Who you go for, Boston or the Florida Panthers? Make sure to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Young Guns podcast. Thank you so much, guys, for watching.